Good day to everybody out there. This is Philosophy Roulette 83. And, Philosophy Roulette 83, where we read philosophy. Alright, so we were looking at our Kentness earlier today. That was a nice paper. Foundations of Physics. Let's take a look at what the Foundations of Physics has. So, Confessions of a Cheap, Sophisticated Substantivalist. Okay, so that's 11 pages, sort of reasonable. I'll take a look at that, maybe. The Whole Argument we looked at this already. So, we looked at some of these. This whole argument stuff. Let's see. The no-go theorem. Yeah, I'm a little worried about formulas like we have Kaluza-Klein with degenerate metric. That seems a little complex. 14 pages. 5 pages. Reconciling kinetic and quantum theory. We show that dilute gas wave function spreading is limited by scattering off other particles. It shows that quantum mechanics can be consistent with kinetic theory of gases. See, this just scares me that it's gonna be all formulas. But let's take a look. If it's there, I can always take a look if it has all the formulas or not, because I can't really read formulas. Let's see. Yeah, you see, we've got they didn't. Let's see, download PDF. Let's take a look real quick. Yeah. See, I can't really handle this sort of level of complex mathematics. That's so not really what I can do. Okay, so continuing on. Frontiers in Psychology, Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. Let's see what Frontiers in Psychology has to offer today. What is a hologenomic adaptation? 1 to 7. Cosmopsychism and consciousness research. A fresh view on the causal mechanism underlying phenomenal states. Ooh, fancy words. Frontiers in. Oh, so is this an open access journal? That might be cool. Download article. Unfortunately, this looks very sciencey. So let's see if this is very sciencey. They got like images and stuff. Alright, this is a very short paper, first of all. But so, who am I to complain? Let's take a look and see what happens. Download PDF. There it goes. Okay. So what do we got? 7 pages. If you are good enough to join me in chat one day, you can grab the paper by typing !paper in the chat box. And this link will pop right back up. Cosmopsychism. That's a fancy sounding thing. Too long of a name. Okay. Okay, so let's go. Is this an abstract? No. Maybe it is. Despite the progress made in studying the observable exteriors of conscious processes, which are reflected in the neural correlates of consciousness, NCC for neural correlates of consciousness. Okay, try to remember that. There are still no satisfactory answers to two closely related core questions. These are the questions of the origin of the subjective, phenomenal aspects of consciousness, and the question of the causal mechanisms underlying the generation of specific phenomenal states. In this article, we address these questions using a novel variant of Cosmopsychism, a holistic form of panpsychism relying on the central idea that the universe is imbued with a ubiquitous field of consciousness, UFC. Alright, so we're going like hardcore panpsychism. So it's not even a everything can think. There's a consciousness field. Alright, exciting. This field is understood as a foundational dual aspect component of the cosmos, the extrinsic appearance of which is physical in nature, and the intrinsic manifestation of which is phenomenological in nature. We argue that this approach brings a new perspective into play, according to which the organizational characteristics of the NCC, are indicative of the brain's interaction with and modulation of the UFC, ubiquitous field of consciousness. Key insights from modern physics suggest that the modulation mechanism is identical with the fundamental mechanism underlying quantum systems, resulting in the conclusion that a coherently oscillating neural cell assembly acquires phenomenal properties by tapping into the universal pool of phenomenal nuances predetermined by the UFC, or more specifically, by entering into a temporary liaison with the UFC and extracting a subset of phenomenal tones from the phenomenal color palette inherent in the basic structure of the UFC. This hypothesis is supported by a substantial body of empirical evidence. I am slightly skeptical about this, but hey, let's go for it. And by slightly, I mean skeptical, just regular skeptical. I mean, first off, a subset of phenomenal tones from the phenomenal color palette. I don't know what this means right here. You could say, you get stuff from some third realm, a la Frege. There's a phenomenological third realm, and you can get phenomenology off of that, sure. But we're going to get tones and color. I mean, you're going to have to give a bigger theory if you're going to start breaking this stuff up already, and it's only a 7-page essay. Oh, but it's double-sided, so we'll find out. Yeah, so it's like 14 pages. Neuroscientific approaches to the study of consciousness assign a pride of place to the task of progressively charting and analyzing the neural correlates of consciousness, that is, the neural mechanisms jointly sufficient for eliciting specific types of conscious experiences. The search for the NCC is motivated in large part by the belief that there are more than mere correlates, namely that such mechanisms provide the causal material basis for consciousness. Significantly, many neuroscientists also hold, or have held, optimistically that an increased knowledge of the NCC will eventually shed light on the fundamental riddle known as the hard problem of consciousness, namely the problem of understanding what it is about the brain which enables it to generate something as remarkable and unique as subjective phenomenal experience. In short, from the point of view of conventional neuroscientific lore, and the activity patterns constituting the NCC are not just observable concomitants of subjective experience in highly complex animals, but rather the ultimate foundation of consciousness. In identifying the NCC with the ultimate basis of consciousness, this conventional approach is beset by two cardinal deficiencies. First, it severely restricts the spectrum of possible causal mechanisms underlying consciousness, a restriction questionable on both empirical and theoretical grounds. Second, it remains orthogonal to the concerns driving the hard problem, unable to address these concerns head-on. Okay, so let's get to the panpsychism. Before we attend to these problems, it is worth recalling first that few would deny that consciousness, as manifested in humans and in other advanced animals such as primates, dolphins, or birds, for example, bears a special connection. What about the octopus and those things? Those things are smart. Anyway, bear special connection unto the brain, and in particular, what the heck? All right. I was only on page 2. Or was I? Okay, dolphins, pumps, or birds bear special consciousness connection to the brain, and in particular to specific processes of activity patterns which neuroscientists identify as the NCC. However, notwithstanding is special connection between consciousness and the brain, and notwithstanding the relevant neuroscientific evidence, the precise nature of this connection remains an open question. In particular, the idea that consciousness is identical to such brain processes, or that these processes generate consciousness from utter insentience, is an interpretation of the data. It is something which neither the phenomenal nor the behavioral nor the neurophysiological data necessitate. To be sure, knowledge of the NCC should inform and constrain our efforts to understand consciousness and to shed light on the nature of the psychophysical nexus, but it does not deliver ready-made answers to the above-mentioned core questions. Yeah, so given our current view of things, the understanding of the physical there is no inherent reason to think it will actually explain consciousness, but it will create biophysical limits on what consciousness could consist of. Against an unnecessary limitation of the theoretical horizons. Excuse me. Consider now the restriction of the spectrum of possible causal mechanisms underlying macro-scale phenomenal consciousness. One sense in which cerebral chauvinism is ill-advised is evinced in accumulation of evidence suggesting that bounds of consciousness in the living world may far exceed cranial circumscription. To begin with, some highly intelligent creatures, such as octopuses, that's what I was saying, we should have said about them earlier, and other cephalopods are endowed with large neural ganglia and on their arms, supporting sophisticated forms of sensing and moving with significant degree of autonomy from the octopus brain. More radically still, there is growing evidence for the existence of complex behavior in organisms lacking brains altogether. An intriguingly broad array of cognitive abilities is being progressively unveiled in simple eukaryotes, prokaryotes, and plants. Variegated forms of perception and behavioral plasticity, information processing, anticipation, memory, learning, valence, problem-solving, communication, and cooperation are attributed to various brainless organisms, from slime molds to bacteria to plants. In congruence with such studies, there is also a growing tendency to view neural networks as but one special case, albeit particularly powerful, of a general network dynamics whose fundamental principles are exemplified throughout the entire spectrum of biological life. In other words, many cognitive functions which in creatures such as macaque, monkeys, bees, or humans are mediated through cerebral activity appear to be manifest to some degree in different forms of life, such as plants, slime molds, or bacteria, using alternative types of informational networks, be it methylation DNA networks, root systems, cytoskeletal elements, non-neural bioelectricity, calcium signaling, and so on. While such studies often do not involve direct reference to consciousness, the steady growth in evidence attesting to the existence of sophisticated cognitive repertoires throughout life's spectrum puts increasing pressure on the orthodox notion that consciousness and NCC are coextensive. As soon as we cease taking such coextension for granted, we enjoy greater freedom to consider a wide range of possible causal mechanisms as potential candidates for a comprehensive explanation of consciousness. Okay, so this is the argument for panpsychism, that there's lots of ways that the brain can't be, like, once you get away from just looking at our brains in our skulls, all the other sort of intelligent activity in the world doesn't seem to be constrained just to some sort of brain area. That's fine, but there's bigger problems, not with necessarily this, but I just think the whole sort of way we think about brains to begin with. But that's fine, so let's see where these folks are going with it. Minding the explanatory gap. Another cause for skepticism regarding the view that the NCC provide the ultimate basis of phenomenal experience is the familiar hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers. Always with the Chalmers. Yeah, it's like, looks like if you're gonna be annoyed about logic, you always quote Grand Priest, and if you're gonna talk about consciousness, you quote Chalmers. Seems like how things are in all the literature at the moment. Be like, damn you, Grand Priest, with your crazy dialetism. It's always like, Chalmers with your hard problem. Rah, rah, rah. Okay. For given any set of neural configurations proposed as a proper physical underpinning for consciousness, there remains the question why such configurations should culminate in subjective experience. In the words of some notably early observers, the chasm between the physical and the phenomenal, as these are canonically understood by science, philosophy, and common sense, appears to be intellectually impassable. Ooh, 1879, good reference. With the result being that hypothesis that experience comes about through the irritation of nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of gin when Aladdin rubbed his lamp. Yeah, so it's a genie. Okay, and that's Huxley from 1866. Which Huxley is that? I forget. First name. Underlying this gap is a fundamental dichotomy between the objective and the subjective. Science approaches its objects of study from an objective third-person perspective. Its descriptions are confined to the outward appearance of things, even when such things, objects, processes, events, or mechanisms unfold inside the body or brain. It concerns itself exclusively with the behavior and structure of causal agents, that is, with the observable exteriors of its target explananda. In contrast, consciousness is a subjective first-person phenomenon. Its inner presence constitutes a manifest immanent reality irreducible to observed behavior and structure. Thus, in any approach confined to external consciousness is bound to remain alien, identified perhaps, but neither fully assimilated nor properly explained. For this reason, it is imprudent to expect that more elaborate accounts of the neural basis of consciousness could ever be sufficient to address the challenge posed by the hard problem. Weaving science and philosophy synergetically. What is needed, we submit, is a fresh outlook, inclusive of consciousness and the intrinsic dimension of things, but at the same time hospitable to objective findings and to rigorous scientific-based analysis. In this respect, the contribution of philosophy is vital. Philosophy's quest is maximally comprehensive in that it seeks to understand reality as a whole. Well, some of it is. As such, it must take into consideration the outer as well as the inner dimension of things. Moreover, its ultimate goal of arriving at integral picture of reality in its entirety implies a commitment to strive to make sense of the connection between two complementary aspects, the objective and the subjective. Consequently, it has ample historical and conceptual resources to draw upon in the effort to contribute to an improved understanding of the psychophysical nexus. In particular, we believe that some philosophical ideas recently discovered and redeveloped within the fields of metaphysics and the philosophy of mind give fresh impetus to consciousness research, and that they provide a conceptual matrix opening up new interpretations of the neuroscientific body of evidence and potentially leading to unprecedented research strategies. In this spirit, we present the central idea behind a novel variant of Cosmopsychism, a holistic form of panpsychism from the genus of priority Cosmopsychism that relies on the assumption of a cosmic level of consciousness, serving as the ultimate bedrock of experiential reality. Okay, so what is Cosmopsychism? The cornerstones of a novel cosmopsychist paradigm. Our approach is based on the central idea that the universe is imbued with an inherently sentient medium, hereafter referred to as ubiquitous field of consciousness. That's the UFC, not the Ultimate Fighting Championship. In order to avoid substance dualism, which would immediately present us with the problem of causal interaction, we require this field to be seamlessly embedded in the edifice of modern physics. Alright, so there's a 100% naturalist view of panpsychism and this ubiquitous field of consciousness. Consequently, we posit that the UFC is a foundational dual aspect component of the cosmos, the extrinsic experience of which is physical in nature, and the intrinsic manifestation, which is phenomenological in nature. More on this in the concluding section. So is it like wave-particle duality, where one side's like physical and the other side's like phenomenological, but just like one side's a particle, the other side's a wave? Let's see how they slice this up, because that's always the rub. easy enough to say what it is, to just give a wide description, but the devil's always in the details. As with all fields that play a role in physics, the extrinsic nature of the UFC should reveal itself in energetic form, which is reflected in a spectrum of oscillations, the so-called normal modes. Moreover, it is to be expected that in its initial state, the field satisfy all essential symmetry requirements: isotropy, homogeneity, scale invariance, Lorentz invariance. I gotta look at scale invariance more. It's, I think, an interesting thing. Entailing that there is no preferential direction, location, and reference system. This leads directly to the conception of the undisturbed UFC as an omnipresent, formless ocean of activity with completely uncorrelated modes. So it's an ether, basically. We'll see. We then postulate that each normal mode is associated with an elementary phenomenal hue. What is a hue? What is a phenomenal hue? Implying that the entire phenomenal color palette is represented by the oscillatory spectrum of the UFC, with the terms borrowed from color vision being understood as illustrative metaphors that we use here and in the following in a broad sense to cover the entire range of phenomenal qualities. Accordingly, from the phenomenological point of view, the ground state of the UFC can be described as a shapeless, undifferentiated ocean of consciousness in the basic structure of which all shades of phenomenal awareness are inherent. Even though from the perspective of our paradigm, no concrete conscious state can be assigned to the maximally disordered ground state of the UFC, experiences collected in deep states of meditation suggest that this ground state may be characterized as a maximally unified phenomenal state. Okay. The ubiquitous background field thus constitutes an entity that embodies the principles of physics and at the same time contains within itself the phenomenological basis of ultimate reality. Okay, so we've got something that acts in terms of energy changes. So it obeys all the physics stuff. But at the same time, it has an associated phenomenal hue. Now, I'm not entirely sure what this association is right here, because each normal mode is associated with an elementary phenomenal hue. What is the nature of this association? Because if it's an association, then of what sort? Is it a dualist sort of association? Like wave-particle dualism is a dualist theory, even though it's not exactly the same, of course, but it is a sort of like, might be worried. I'm a little worried here that they're sneaking in a dualism just embedded within the physics. Following this line of thought, it is natural to assume that conscious systems must be equipped with a fundamental mechanism by means of which they are able to influence the basic structure of the UFC, resulting in the modified UFC states, each of which displays complementarity, intimately related physical and phenomenal properties. Without such a mechanism, well, it's called a pineal gland. Come on, people. Without such a mechanism, there would be no conscious state other than the ground state of the UFC. Therefore, a distinctive feature of conscious systems in comparison to non-conscious systems must be the capacity to modulate the omnipresent field of consciousness, imposing constraints on the modulation mechanism. Okay, I'm going to call it the pineal gland. A look at the previously postulated properties of the UFC, according to which each normal mode of the field is linked to an elementary phenomenal hue, gives rise to the hypothesis that specific complex states of consciousness are formed by binding together specific sets of field modes. Consequently, using a rendering that is in accordance with modern physics, we argue that conscious states are caused by the dynamic interaction of a physical system with the UFC, provided that the different modes corresponding to the resonance frequencies of the system are involved in this interaction, that the physical system establishes a transiently stable relationship with the background field, resulting in the phase-locking coupling of the participating modes. Okay? From this point of view, a physical system acquires phenomenal properties by entering into a temporary liaison with the cosmic field of consciousness and extracting a subset of phenomenal tones from the spectrum of all phenomenal tones potentially present in the field. So when I'm looking at this This is like right in front of me, this paper. Like, I'm looking at you, I'm looking at the paper, it's like right below it. So this physical system is somehow in synergy with something in my head, and it's creates a transient stable relationship with background field, resulting in the phase lock coupling with the participating modes, specifically which are the phenomenal experience of looking at this screen with this paper on it right now, like these words. Okay, fine. Conversely, this means that the phenomenal shades a given system can extract are determined by the range of dynamically stable states arising from the system-specific set of resonance frequencies. So is this like screen and resonant frequency giving me the stable state of looking at the paper here? I guess that must be the case. Okay, as a direct consequence, systems that cannot achieve dynamic equilibrium with the UFC have no access to its immanent phenomenal color palette and hence cannot generate phenomenal states. So there has to be some sort of thing on my side. The the organism or the conscious thing has to be able to achieve dynamic equilibrium with the UFC, which is the phenomenal bearing physics stuff out in the world. Okay, so we've got some pictures, which is always nice. And then the pictures show how the physics works with the stuff. Okay, so this is I'm trying. I don't know panpsychism well enough. I'm just thinking this seems reasonably panpsychist with a scientific twist on it, which is cool. I mean, it's a sort of a very sciencey version of panpsychism, which is welcome. Actually, I'd like a nice naturalistic panpsychism. All right, so the novel Cosmopsychist paradigm meets reality. It is now of vital significance that recent developments in modern physics are fully compatible with the above considerations. This applies particularly to stochastic electrodynamics, a branch of physics that affords a look behind the scenes of quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, thereby unveiling the mechanisms that account for the quantum behavior of matter. The foundations of SED, which date back to the 60s, have been permanently refined in the endeavor to build a solid conceptual framework for quantum theory. Lots and lots of references. This is all the same. A pivotal ingredient of this framework is an all-pervasive electromagnetic background field called zero-point field, which in its original form is a homogeneous isotropic scale-invariant and maximally disordered ocean of energy with completely uncorrelated field modes and a unique power spectral density. Based on this idea, the key findings of SED may be summarized to the effect: 1. Every material system can be regarded as an open stochastic system in permanent contact with random ZPF, zero-point field. The dynamic interaction between a physical system and the ZPF can achieve energetic equilibrium, given that the interaction strength between the oscillating components and the relevant field modes for which the system exhibits a strong resonant behavior exceeds disturbing forces such as thermal noise. A system in equilibrium with ZPF falls into a dynamically stable state that is an attractor and displays quantum behavior. The orchestration of an attractor requires the initially chaotic ZPF to change over a partially ordered state that is characterized by an attractor-specific set of phase-locked field modes, which has the consequence that all the components of the system are effectively coupled through the ZPF, giving rise to collective cooperation and long-range coherence. Okay, so this is some sort of field that just is around and looks like it's going to this is where the UFC is going to live. In light of these insights, SED commends itself as a promising approach for the integration of consciousness into a coherent theoretical framework. In particular, the findings listed above suggest that the ZPF is perfectly suited for playing the dual role as the carrier of both primordial energy and consciousness, which amounts to identifying the UFC with the ZPF. Moreover, in view of the previously formulated postulates regarding to phenomenal states, the discovery of SED supports the assertion that the mechanism underlying quantum systems has all the makings of a truly fundamental mechanism behind conscious systems, leading to the assumption that conscious systems extract their phenomenal qualities from the phenomenal color palette immanent in the ZPF. As a derivation, conscious systems can be expected to display quantum behavior, meaning that the formation of transiently stable coherent states is an essential prerequisite for conscious awareness. Exactly this expectation is confirmed especially as the currently available body of evidence and the entirety of observations suggest that the brain has all the characteristics of a macroscopic quantum system, which is substantiated in the following. Limiting ourselves for the moment to conscious perception, is widely accepted that the NCC are correlated to large-scale synchronization in the brain, a conclusion that is based on considerable amount of neurophysiological data. A closer examination of the data reveals that the NCC can be equated with attractors distinguishing themselves by a high degree of coherence between spatially distributed cortical areas that are streams of conscious perception are based on the recurring formation and dissolution of such coherent states. These insights corroborate the assertion that the NCC bear on quantum coherence, since a rigorous description of the observed features such as macroscopic patterns, pattern formation, and second-order phase transitions requires the formation of quantum physics, which was also clearly emphasized by Freeman and Vitiello, including the previous enumerating findings of SED. This indicates that the ZPF is involved in the orchestration of coherent neural brain patterns, and that the brain produces an individual stream of consciousness by periodically modifying the ZPF. It should be pointed out that this self-consistent explanatory approach can be extended beyond conscious perception to incorporate also self-referential consciousness, altered states of consciousness, as well as declarative memory functions. Alright, I'm not a panpsychist, or I haven't thought about it enough at least to give a good way to do it, but this looks like it's trying to build in the stuff that they can't get in the head into the physics. Like, they can't figure out how to get the phenomenal consciousness into the physics inside our brain, so this is pushing it out into the world, which is an interesting strategy. Like, okay, so panpsychism pushes out into the world, and then this is doing the further job of specifying where exactly it's pushed into this ZPF property of the physical systems. Okay, so it's saying if you go down to this level, then you have something that is fundamental enough to carry a consciousness within it as some part of its physical structure. Alright, I mean, I'm still worried that that's just pushing dualism around and it's not actually solving the problem, but it might be more amenable to a naturalistic viewpoint than if the dualism is in the world and can be manipulated by physics. So that's interesting. Conclusion and outlook. The strength of the novel cosmopsychist paradigm presented here lies in the bridging of the explanatory gap the conventional materialist doctrine struggles with. This is achieved by proposing a comprehensible causal mechanism for the formation of phenomenal states that is phenomenal states that is deeply rooted in the foundations of the universe. More specifically, the sort of cosmopsychism we advocate brings a new perspective into play, according to which the structural, functional, and organizational characteristics of NCC are indicative of the brain's interaction and modulation of a UFC. In this respect, the key insight from SED suggests that this field can be equated with the ZPF, and too many acronyms, and that the modulation mechanism is identical with the fundamental mechanism underlying quantum systems, resulting in our conclusion that a coherently oscillating neural cell assembly acquires its phenomenal properties by tapping into the universal pool of phenomenal nuances predetermined by the ZPF. This hypothesis is supported by a large body of empirical evidence. I mean, I'd like to see exactly what the empirical evidence consists of. I remember hearing years ago philosophy of philosopher of physics, say that, look, quantum phenomena are really, really, really small. They're really much smaller than neurons. I mean, the neurons are made of, they're big cells. They're not like small cells, and like even at that point, they're talking about like interactions of cell to cell. The quantum states in the physics are much, much smaller. So how does something that's so big as a cell, which you can see with like a regular microscope, it's just a little bit of magnification, how does that get down to the quantum level, which is massively teeny in comparison? I don't know. I'd have to look up that reference, see if that guy actually ever... He said he was going to write something. I don't know if he ever did. Okay. The novel cosmopsychist paradigm elegantly circumvents the hard problem that arises in prevailing materialist approaches, because there are principled reasons to doubt that phenomenal facts are necessitated by purely structural or functional or organizational facts. The crucial difference is that in our approach, the relevant structural facts are tasked not with generation of experience per se, but rather with its modulation and restricted expression, leading to a well-defined distinctive feature between consciousness and non-conscious systems, as well as conscious and unconscious brain processes. In this context, it should be highlighted that the proposed causal mechanism underlying phenomenal states is predicted to be accompanied by a concomitant phenomenon, namely the emission of characteristic photon pulses, paving the way for a new research strategy that aims at corroborating the hypothesis formulated in this paper, and eventually ends in the systematic derivation of psychophysical mapping rules between particular qualia and particular sets of phase-locked ZPF modes. Okay, so if you think you can then are going to find the phenomena that this mapping here, if you think you're going to find this mapping, how would you actually determine that the phenomenal modes are actually out there in the ZPF? You're only going to find out that there's, using conventional physical experiments, that you might find some correlation, but the world was already correlated with things that were going on our head. So why would there be how would you actually measure the qualia to this other physical stuff over and above the experiments we do right now? And then why would those experiments be different from the current experiments that do also currently measure how, when we see something in the world, then it affects our brain, and then something in our head, not necessarily brain, whatever your preferred term is at this point, but phase locking or mirror neuroning, something or othering. How would you actually get the further experimental data to show that you have a particular qualia and particular phase locked ZPF modes? I mean, what would be the new thing that was actually being demonstrated? I don't know. So I'd like to see how you'd distinguish that from every other experiment. Finally, a note is appropriate with regard to the causal interpretation of our UFC account. According to our approach, the UFC has two complementary description levels, hence the earlier reference to a double aspect perspective, each of which is coherent in itself. Yes, that's a problem. This might be the dualism I was worried about being baked in. From the physical perspective, the dynamic interaction of the UFC with material systems can be consistently described in terms of energy transfer, ensuring causal closure and energy conservation, so that the evolution of the UFC is fully determined by its physical properties. On this reading, the evolving field passes through a series of physical states, and the phenomenal qualities associated with each state can be regarded as accompanying features of physical processes. On the other hand, even though there remains certainly a lot of work to be done, we believe that our approach has the potential to set the stage for a phenomenological interpretation of dynamical processes, meaning that the processes of which we usually think in terms of physical causation may be self-consistently interpreted in conceptually alternative phenomenal terms. From this point of view, consciousness may be causally efficacious and turn out to be the ultimate intrinsic force underlying the dynamic transformations described by physics, thus laying the foundations for a scientifically informed idealist worldview. This is definitely idealist. Okay, and lots of references, which is very nice. Yeah. So this is like I think I stated my worries about the dualism getting baked into it. I just don't know enough about panpsychism because it is sort of in vogue at the moment. So there's no real reason to think that this is any worse than anything else because I wouldn't know. Or it might be much better for all I know. This might be great. I guess I just have this sort of standard worries about dualism, like sneaking in and like having its head like rearing over here. And then what was the other thing I was worried about? Yeah, this mapping between things. Like, what exactly is Tad worried about exactly how this mapping is going to go? What sort of experiment would show this sort of thing, as opposed to every other experiment? Because it feels like you're looking for the ether here, and it's like, well, ether theories don't work because it's like whatever you look for, you're always going to get the physical stuff, not the ether. So that's my other. I had one more where I forget what it was now, but anyway, this is an interesting paper because if you're gonna, panpsychism is basically a reasonably well, at the moment at least, it seems like it's on the resurgent path, and so more people are considering this very seriously. So this is an interesting way of trying to tie it down to a physical process, which is the UFC and the 0 point thingy at the end, the 0 point. Okay, so I guess that's it for now. This is been going for about like 40 minutes. So I'll be back in the morning, and I've also started live streaming Minesweeper. So if you want to watch Minesweeper, I mean, it has more viewers than this, I fear, but maybe not. I don't think anyone's going to go back and watch me play Minesweeper. They might do that live, but I am getting plenty of views on the YouTube copies of this, so that's always nice. But I would love to have you join me live. The chat box is cool. You can ask questions. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. So have a good night, everyone. Stay safe.